The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 1, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 4, Side 1. On a brief trip to Rome in 1432, Donatello designed a classic tabernacle in marble for the old St. Peter's. Probably in Rome he studied the portrait busts that had survived from the days of the Empire. In any case, it was he who developed the first significant portrait sculpture of the Renaissance. His chef-d'oeuvre in portraiture was his bust, in painted terracotta, of the politician Niccolò da Uzzano. Here he amused and expressed himself with a realism that offered no compliments, but revealed a man. Donatello made his own discovery of the old truth that art need not always pursue beauty, but must seek to select and reveal significant form. Many dignitaries risked the veracity of his chisel, sometimes to their discomfiture. A Genoese merchant, dissatisfied with himself as Donatello saw him, haggled about the price. The matter was referred to Cosimo, who judged that Donatello had asked too little. The merchant complained that the artist had taken only a month for the work, so that the fee demanded came to half a florin, or $12.50 per day. Too much, he thought, for a mere artist. Donatello smashed the bust into 1,000 pieces, saying that this was a man who could bargain intelligently only about beans. The cities of Italy appreciated him better and competed for his services. Siena, Rome, and Venice lured him for a time, but Padua saw him fashion his masterpiece. In the Church of St. Anthony he carved a marble screen for the altar that covered the bones of the great Franciscan, and over it he placed moving reliefs and a bronze crucifixion most tenderly conceived. In the piazza before the church he set up, in 1453, the first important equestrian statue of modern times. Inspired, doubtless, by the mounted Aurelius in Rome, but thoroughly Renaissance in face and mood. No idealized philosopher king, but a man of visibly contemporary character, fearless, ruthless, powerful. Gattamelata, the honeyed cat, the Venetian general. It is true that the chafing, foaming horse is too big for his legs, and that the pigeons, innocent of Vasari, daily bespatter the bald head of the conquering condottiere. But the pose is proud and strong, as if all the virtu of Machiavelli's longing had here passed with the fused bronze to harden in Donatello's mold. Padua gazed in astonishment and glory at this hero rescued from mortality, gave the artist 1,650 golden ducats, or over $41,000, for his 6 years of toil, and begged him to make their city his home. He whimsically demurred. His art could never improve at Padua, where all men praised him. He must for art's sake return to Florence, where all men criticized him. In truth, he returned to Florence because Cosimo needed him, and he loved Cosimo. Cosimo was a man who understood art, and gave him intelligent and bountiful commissions. So close was the entente between them that Donatello divined from the slightest indication all that Cosimo desired. At Donatello's suggestion, Cosimo collected ancient statuary, sarcophagi, arches, columns, and capitals, and placed them in the Medici gardens for young artists to study. For Cosimo, with Michelozzo's collaboration, Donatello set up in the baptistry a tomb of the refugee anti-pope John the 23rd. For Cosimo's favorite church, San Lorenzo, he carved 2 pulpits and adorned them with bronze reliefs of the Passion. From those pulpits, among others, Savonarola would launch his bolts against later Medici. For the altar he molded a lovely terracotta bust of St. Florence. For the old sacristy he designed 2 pairs of bronze doors and a simple but beautiful sarcophagus for Cosimo's parents. Other works came from him as if they were child's play, an exquisite stone relief of the Annunciation for the Church of Santa Croce. For the cathedral, a cantoria of singing boys, plump putti violently chanting hymns, this from 1433 to 1438. A bronze bust of a young man, the incarnation of healthy youth, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. A Santa Cecilia, possibly by Desiderio da Settignano, fair enough to be the Christian muse of song. A bronze relief of the Crucifixion, in the Bargello, overpowering in its realistic detail. And in Santa Croce another crucifixion, a gaunt and solitary figure in wood, one of the most moving representations of this scene, despite Brunellesco's criticism of it as a crucified peasant. patron and artist grew old together, and Cosimo took such care of the sculptor that Donatello rarely thought about money. He kept his funds, says Vasari, in a basket suspended from the ceiling of his studio, and bade his aides and friends take from it according to their needs, without consulting him. When Cosimo was dying in 1464, he recommended Donatello to the care of his son Piero. Piero gave the old artist a house in the country, but Donatello soon returned to Florence, preferring his accustomed studio to the sunshine and insects of the countryside. He lived in simplicity and content till the age of 80. All the artists, nearly all the people of Florence, joined in the funeral that laid him to rest, as he had asked, in the crypt of San Lorenzo, beside Cosimo's own tomb, this in 1466. He had immeasurably advanced the sculptural art. Now and then he poured too much force into his poses and designs. Often he fell short of the finished form that exalts Ghiberti's doors. But his faults were due to his resolve to express not beauty so much as life, not merely a strong and healthy body, but a complex character or mental state. He developed sculptural portraiture by extending it from the religious to the secular field, and by giving his subjects an unprecedented variety, individuality, and power. Overcoming 100 technical difficulties, he created the first great equestrian statue left to us by the Renaissance. Only one sculptor would reach greater heights, and then by inheriting what Donatello had learned, achieved, and taught. Bertoldo was Donatello's pupil, and the teacher of Michelangelo. 3. Luca della Robbia. The picture that takes form in our minds as we read Vasari's biographies of Ghiberti and Donatello shows the studio of a Renaissance sculptor as the cooperative enterprise of many hands, directed by one mind, but transmitting the art, day by day, from master to apprentice, generation after generation. From such studios came minor sculptors who left to history a less imperious fame, but in their degree contributed to give to passing beauty a lasting form. Nanni di Banco inherited a fortune and had the means to be worthless, but he fell in love with sculpture and Donatello, and served a faithful apprenticeship under him until he could set up his own studio. He carved a St. Philip for the niche of the Shoemakers' Guild in Or San Michele, and for the cathedral a St. Luke seated with the Gospel in his hand and looking out with all the confidence of fresh faith upon a Renaissance Italy just beginning to doubt. In another studio, the brothers Bernardo and Antonio Rossellino combined their skills in architecture and sculpture. Bernardo designed a classic tomb in Santa Croce for Leonardo Bruni. Then, on the accession of Nicholas V, he went to Rome and consumed himself in the great Pope's architectural revolution. Antonio reached his zenith at 34 in 1461 with his marble tomb in San Miniato at Florence for Don Jaime, Cardinal of Portugal. Here is the victory of the classic style in all but the angel's wings, the cardinal's vestments, and his crown of virginity, for James had startled his time by his chastity. America has two lovely examples of Antonio's work, the marble bust of the Christ Child in the Morgan Library, and the young St. John the Baptist in the National Gallery. And is there anywhere a nobler example of realistic portraiture than the powerful head, corrugated with veins and furrowed with thought, of the physician Giovanni di San Miniato in the Victoria and Albert Museum? Desiderio de Settignano came to Florence from the nearby village that gave him his cognomen. He joined Donatello's staff, saw that the master's work lacked only patient finish, and distinguished his own productions with elegance, simplicity, and grace. His tomb for Marsupini did not quite equal Rossellino's for Bruni, but the tabernacle that he designed for the Church of San Lorenzo in 1464 pleased all who saw it, and his incidental portraits and reliefs augmented his fame. He died at 36. What might he have done if given, like his master, 80 years? Luca della Robbia was granted 82, and used them well. He raised terracotta work almost to the level of a major art, and his fame outjourneyed Donatello's. There is hardly a museum in Europe that does not display the tenderness of his Madonnas, the cheerful blue and white of his painted clay. Beginning as a goldsmith, like so many artists of the Renaissance, and learning in that minuscule field all the delicacies of design, he passed on to sculptured relief and carved 5 marble plaques for Giotto's Campanile. Perhaps the wardens of the cathedral did not tell Luca that those reliefs excelled Giotto's, but they soon commissioned him to adorn the organ loft with a relief picturing choir boys and girls in the ecstasy of song. 2 years later, in 1433, Donatello carved a similar cantoria. The rival reliefs now face each other in the Opera di Duomo, or works of the cathedral. Both of them powerfully convey the exuberant vitality of childhood. Here the Renaissance discovered children for art. In 1446 the wardens engaged him to make reliefs for the bronze doors of a cathedral sacristy. These could not rival Ghiberti's, but they saved Lorenzo de' Medici's life in the Pazzi conspiracy. All Florence now acclaimed Luca as a master. So far he had followed the traditional methods of the sculptor's art. Meanwhile, however, he had been experimenting with clay, seeking to find a way in which this tractable material could be made as beautiful in texture as marble. He molded the clay into the form designed, covered it with a glaze of divers chemicals, and baked it in a specially constructed kiln. The wardens admired the result and commissioned him to place terracotta representations of the Resurrection and the Ascension over the doors of the cathedral sacristies in 1443 and 1446. These tympanums, though in monochrome white, made a stir by the novelty of their material and the refinement of their finish and design. Cosimo and his son Piero ordered similar terracottas for the Medici Palace and for Piero's chapel in San Miniato. In these Luca added blue to the dominant white. Orders came to him now in an abundance that tempted him to rapid facility. He brightened with a terracotta coronation of the Virgin, the portal of the church of the Ognissanti, and the portal of the Badia with a tenderly graceful Madonna and Child, between such angels as might reconcile us to an eternity of heaven. For the church of San Giovanni in Pistoia, he attempted a large terracotta Visitation. It was a fresh departure in the aged features of Elizabeth and the youthful innocence and diffidence of Mary. So Luca created a new realm of art and founded a Della Robbia dynasty that would flourish till the end of the century. 7. Painting. 1. Masaccio. In 14th century Italy, painting dominated sculpture. In the 15th century, sculpture dominated painting. In the 16th, painting again took the lead. Perhaps the genius of Giotto in the Trecento, of Donatello in the Quattrocento, of Leonardo, Raphael, and Titian in the Cinquecento played some part in this alteration. And yet genius is more a function than a cause of the spirit of an age. Perhaps in Giotto's time the recovery and revelation of classic sculpture had not yet provided such stimulus and direction as they were to give to Ghiberti and Donatello. But that stimulus reached its height in the 16th century. Why did it not lift the Sansovinos and Cellinis, as well as Michelangelo, above the painters of that time? And why was Michelangelo, primarily a sculptor, forced more and more into painting? Was it because Renaissance art had tasks and needs too wide and deep for sculpture? Art, liberated by intelligent and opulent patronage, wished to cover the whole field of representation and ornament. To do this with statuary would have taken time, toil, and money prohibitively. Painting could more readily express the double gamut of Christian and pagan ideas in a hurried and exuberant age. What sculptor could have portrayed the life of St. Francis as rapidly as Giotto and with Giotto's excellence? Moreover, Renaissance Italy included a majority of persons whose feelings and ideas were still medieval, and even the emancipated minority harbored echoes and memories of the old theology, of its hopes and fears and mystic visions, its devotion and tenderness and pervasive spiritual overtones. All these, as well as the beauties and ideals expressed in Greek and Roman sculpture, had to find vent and form in Italian art, and painting offered to do it at least more conveniently, if not also with greater fidelity and subtlety than sculpture. Sculpture had studied the body so long and lovingly that it was not at home in representing the soul, though Gothic carvers had now and then made spiritual stone. Renaissance art had to portray both body and soul, face and feeling. It had to be sensitive to, take the impress of, all the range and moods of piety, affection, passion, suffering, skepticism, sensualism, pride, and power. Only laborious genius could accomplish this with marble, bronze, or clay. When Ghiberti and Donatello attempted it, they had to carry into sculpture the methods, perspectives, and nuances of painting, and sacrificed to vivid expression the ideal form and placid repose required of Greek statuary in the Golden Age. Finally, the painter spoke a language more easily understood by the people, in colors that seized the eye, in scenes or narratives that told beloved tales. The Church found that painting moved the people more quickly, touching their hearts more intimately than any carving of cold marble or casting of somber bronze. As the Renaissance progressed and art broadened its scope and aim, sculpture receded into the background, painting advanced. And as sculpture had been the highest art expression of the Greeks, so now painting, widening its field, varying its forms, improving its skills, became the supreme and characteristic art, the very face and soul of the Renaissance. In this period it was still groping and immature. Paolo Uccello studied perspective until nothing else interested him. Fra Angelico was the perfection in life and art of the medieval ideal. Only Masaccio felt the new spirit that would soon triumph in Botticelli, Leonardo, and Raphael. Certain minor talents had transmitted the techniques and traditions of the art. Giotto taught Gaddo Gaddi, who taught Taddeo Gaddi, who taught Agnolo Gaddi, who, as late as 1380, adorned Santa Croce with frescoes still in Giottesque style. Agnolo's pupil, Cennino Cennini, gathered into a Libro dell'Arte in 1437 the accumulated knowledge of his time in drawing, composition, mosaic, pigments, oils, varnishes, and other phases of the painter's work. Here, says page 1, begins the book of the art, made and composed in the reverence of God and the Virgin Mary and all the saints, and in the reverence of Giotto, of Taddeo, and of Agnolo. Art was becoming a religion. Agnolo's greatest pupil was a Camaldolese monk, Lorenzo Monaco. In the magnificent altarpiece, The Coronation of the Virgin, that Florence the monk painted in 1413 for his Monastery of the Angels, a fresh vigor of conception and execution appeared. The faces were individualized, the colors were brilliant and strong. But in that triptych there was no perspective. The figures in the rear rose taller than those in the foreground, like heads in an audience seen from the stage. Who would teach Italian painters the science of perspective? Brunellesco, Ghiberti, Donatello had made approaches to it. Paolo Uccello almost gave his life to the problem. Night after night he pored over it to the fury of his wife. "How charming a thing is this perspective," he told her. "Ah, if I could only get you to understand its delights." Nothing seemed to Paolo more beautiful than the steady approximation and distant merging of parallel lines in the furrows of a pictured field. Aided by a Florentine mathematician, Antonio Manetti, he set himself to formulate the laws of perspective. He studied how to represent accurately the receding arches of a vault, the ungainly enlargement of objects as they advanced into the foreground, the peculiar distortion of columns arranged in a curve. At last he felt that he had reduced these mysteries to rules. Through these rules, one dimension could convey the illusion of three. Painting could represent space and depth. This, to Paolo, seemed a revolution as great as any in the history of art. He illustrated his principles in his painting, and colored the cloisters of Santa Maria Novella with frescoes that startled his contemporaries, but have yielded to the erosion of time. Still surviving is his vivid portrait of Sir John Hawkwood on the wall of a cathedral from 1436, the proud condottiere, having turned his arms from attacking to defending Florence, now joined in the Duomo the company of scholars and saints. Meanwhile, another line of development had reached from the same origin to the same end. Antonio Veneziano was a follower of Giotto. Gherardo Starnina was a pupil of Veneziano. From Starnina stemmed Masolino de Panicale, who taught Masaccio. Masolino and Masaccio made their own studies of perspective. Masolino was one of the first Italians to paint nudes. Masaccio was the first to apply the new principles of perspective with a success that opened the eyes of his generation and began a new era in pictorial art. His real name was Tommaso Guidi di San Giovanni. Masaccio was a nickname meaning Big Thomas, as Masolino meant Little Thomas. Italy was fond of giving such identifying marks to her children. Taking to the brush at an early age, he so lost himself in devotion to painting that he neglected everything else: his clothes, his person, his income, his debts. He worked a while with Ghiberti, and may have learned in that Bottega Academy the anatomical precision that was to be one mark of his drawing. He studied the frescoes that Masolino was painting in the Brancacci Chapel at Santa Maria del Carmine, and noted with special delight their experiments in perspective and foreshortening. On a pillar in the abbey church known as the Badia, he represented St. Ivo of Brittany with feet foreshortened as seen from below. The spectators refused to believe that a saint could have such mighty feet. In Santa Maria Novello, as part of a fresco of the Trinity, he pictured a barrel vault in such perfect diminishing perspective that the eye seemed to see the painted ceiling as sunk into the church wall. The epical masterpiece that made him the teacher of 3 generations was his continuation of Masolino's Brancacci Chapel frescoes on the life of St. Peter from 1423. The incident of the tribute money was represented by the young artist with a new power of conception and veracity of line. Christ with stern nobility, Peter in angry majesty, the tax collector with the lithe frame of a Roman athlete, every apostle individualized in feature, raiment, and pose. Buildings and background hills illustrated the young science of perspective, and Tommaso himself, self-portrayed by posing to a mirror, became a bearded apostle in the crowd. While he was working on this series, the chapel was consecrated with processional ceremony. Masaccio watched the ritual with sharp, attentive eye, then reproduced it in a fresco in the cloister. Brunellesco, Donatello, Masolino, Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, and Antonio Brancacci, sponsor of the chapel, had taken part, and now found themselves in the picture. In 1425, for reasons now unknown, Masaccio left his work unfinished and went to Rome. We do not hear of him again, and we can only surmise that some accident or disease prematurely ended his life. But even though incomplete, those Brancacci frescoes were recognized at once as an immense step forward in painting. In those bold nudes, graceful draperies, startling perspectives, realistic foreshortenings, and precise anatomical details, in this modeling in depth through subtle gradations of light and shade, all sensed a new departure, which Vasari called the modern style. Every ambitious painter within reach of Florence came to study the series. Fra Angelico, Fra Lippi, Andrea del Castagno, Verrocchio, Ghirlandaio, Botticelli, Perugino, Piero della Francesca, Leonardo, Fra Bartolomeo, Andrea del Sarto, Michelangelo, Raphael. No dead man had ever had such distinguished pupils. No artist since Giotto had wielded, unwittingly, such influence. Masaccio, said Leonardo, showed by perfect works that those who are led by any guide except nature, the supreme mistress, are consumed in sterile toil. 2. Fra Angelico. Amid these exciting novelties, Fra Angelico went quietly his own medieval way. Born in a Tuscan village and named Guido di Pietro, he came to Florence young and studied painting, probably with Lorenzo Monaco. His talent ripened quickly, and he had every prospect of making a comfortable place for himself in the world, but the love of peace and the hope of salvation led him to enter the Dominican order in 1407. After a long novitiate in various cities, Fra Giovanni, as he had been renamed, settled down in the convent of San Domenico in Fiesole in 1418. There, in happy obscurity, he illuminated manuscripts and painted pictures for churches and religious confraternities. In 1436, the friars of San Domenico were transferred to the new convent of San Marco, built by Michelozzo at Cosimo's order and expense. During the next 9 years, Giovanni painted 100 frescoes on the walls of the monastery church, chapter house, dormitory, refectory, hospice, cloisters, and cells. Meanwhile, he practiced religion with such modest devotion that his fellow friars called him the angelic brother, Fra Angelico. No one ever saw him angry or succeeded in offending him. Thomas à Kempis would have found fully realized in him the imitation of Christ, except for one smiling lapse. In a last judgment, the angelic Dominican could not resist placing a few Franciscan friars in hell. Painting, with Fra Giovanni, was a religious exercise as well as an aesthetic release and joy. He painted in much the same mood in which he prayed, and he never painted without praying first. Protected from the harsh competitions of life, He saw it all as a hymn of divine atonement and love. His subjects were invariably religious: the life of Mary and Christ, the blessed in heaven, the lives of the saints and the generals of his order. His aim was not so much to create beauty as to inspire piety. In the chapter house where the friars held their assemblies, he painted the picture that the prior thought should most frequently be in their minds, the crucifixion. A powerful representation, in which Angelico showed his study of the nude, and at the same time the all-embracing quality of his Christianity. Here, at the foot of the cross, along with St. Dominic, were the founders of rival orders: Augustine, Benedict, Bernard, Francis, John Gualberto of the Vallambrosans, Albert of the Carmelites. In a lunette over the entrance to the hospice, where the friars were required to offer hospitality to any wayfarer, Angelico told the story of the pilgrim who proved to be Christ. Every pilgrim was to be treated as if he might be so revealed. Within the hospice are now gathered some of the subjects painted by Angelico for divers churches and guilds. The Madonna of the Linaioli, or linen workers, where the angel choristers have the pliant figures of women and the smiling faces of guileless children. A Descent from the Cross, equal in beauty and tenderness to any of the 1,000 representations of that scene in the art of the Renaissance. And a Last Judgment, a bit too symmetrical, and crowded with lurid and repellent fantasies, as if to forgive were human and to hate were divine. At the top of the staircase leading to the cells stands Angelico's masterpiece, the Annunciation, an angel of infinite grace already in his obeisance, revering the future Mother of God, and Mary bowing and crossing her hands in humble incredulity. In each of the 100 cells, the loving friar, aided by his friar pupils, found time to paint a fresco recalling some inspiring gospel scene: the Transfiguration, the communion of the apostles, Magdalene anointing the feet of Christ. In the double cell where Cosimo played monk, Angelico painted a crucifixion and an adoration of the kings, gorgeous with such Eastern costumes as perhaps the artist had seen in the Council of Florence. In his own cell he pictured the coronation of the Virgin. It was his favorite subject, which he painted time and again. The Uffizi Gallery has one form of it, the Academy at Florence another, the Louvre a third. Best of all is that which Angelico painted for the dormitory of San Marco, wherein the figures of Christ and Mary are among the most exquisite in the history of art. The fame of these devout creations brought Giovanni hundreds of proffered commissions. To all such seekers he replied that they must first obtain the consent of his prior. That secured, he would not fail them. When Nicholas V asked him to come to Rome, he left his Florentine cell and went to decorate the chapel of the Pope with scenes from the lives of St. Stephen and St. Lawrence. They are still among the most pleasant sights in the Vatican. Nicholas so admired the painter that he offered to make him Archbishop of Florence. Angelico excused himself and recommended his beloved prior. Nicholas accepted the suggestion, and Fra Antonino remained a saint, even under the pallium. No painter except El Greco ever made a style so uniquely his own as Fra Angelico. Even a novice can identify his hand. A simplicity of line and form going back to Giotto, a narrow but ethereal assemblage of colors, gold, vermilion, scarlet, blue, and green, reflecting a bright spirit and happy faith, figures perhaps too simply imaged and almost without anatomy, faces beautiful and gentle, but too pale to be alive, too monotonously alike in monks, angels, and saints, conceived rather as flowers in paradise, and all redeemed by an ideal spirit of tender devotion, a purity of mood and thought recalling the finest moments of the Middle Ages and never to be captured again by the Renaissance. This was the final cry of the medieval spirit in art. Fra Giovanni worked for a year in Rome, for a time in Orvieto, served for 3 years as prior of the Dominican convent in Fiesole, was called back to Rome, and died there at the age of 68. Probably it was Lorenzo Valla's classic pen that wrote his epitaph. Let it not be to my praise that I was as another Apelles, but that I gave all my gains, O Christ, to your faithful. For some works are for the earth, some for heaven. I, Giovanni, was a child of the Tuscan city of Florence. 3. Fra Filippo Lippi. From the gentle Angelico, crossed with the lusty Masaccio, came the art of a man who preferred life to eternity. Filippo, son of the butcher Tommaso Lippi, was born in Florence in a poor street behind the convent of the Carmelites. Orphaned at 2, he was reluctantly reared by an aunt, who rid herself of him when he was 8 by entering him into the Carmelite order. Instead of studying the books assigned to him, he covered their margins with caricatures. The prior, noting their excellence, set him to drawing the frescoes that Masaccio had just painted in the Carmelite church. Soon the lad was painting frescoes of his own in that same church. They have disappeared, but Vasari thought them as good as Masaccio's. At the age of 26, in 1432, Filippo left the monastery. He continued to call himself Fra, brother, friar, but he lived in the world and supported himself by his art. Vasari tells a story that tradition has accepted, though we cannot test its truth. Filippo is said to have been so amorous that when he saw a woman who pleased him, he would have given all his possessions to have her, and if he could not succeed in this, he quieted the flame of his love by painting her portrait. This appetite so took possession of him that while the humor lasted, he paid little or no attention to his work. Thus, on one occasion, when Cosimo was employing him, he shut him up in the house so that he might not go out and waste time. Filippo remained so for 2 days, but, overcome by his amorous and bestial desires, he cut up his sheet with a pair of scissors, and letting himself out of the window, devoted many days to his pleasures. When Cosimo could not find him, he caused a search to be made for him, until at length Filippo returned to his labors. From that time forward Cosimo gave him liberty to go and come as he chose, repenting that he had shut him up. For, he said, geniuses are celestial forms, and not pack-asses. Ever afterward he sought to hold Filippo by the bonds of affection, and was thus served by him with greater readiness. In 1439, Fra Lippo described himself in a letter to Piero de' Medici as the poorest friar in Florence, living with and supporting with difficulty 6 nieces anxious to be married. His work was in demand, but apparently not as well paid as the nieces wished. His morals could not have been notoriously bad, for we find him engaged to paint pictures for various nunneries. At the convent of Santa Margherita in Prato, unless Vasari and tradition err, he fell in love with Lucrezia Buti, a nun or a ward of the nuns. He persuaded the prioress to let Lucrezia pose for him as the Virgin. Soon they eloped. Despite her father's reproaches and appeals, she remained with the artist as his mistress and model, sat for many virgins, and gave him a son, the Filippino Lippi of later fame. The wards of the cathedral at Prato did not hold these adventures against Filippo. In 1456 they engaged him to paint the choir with frescoes illustrating the lives of St. John the Baptist and St. Stephen. These paintings, now much damaged by time, were acclaimed as masterpieces, perfect in composition, rich in color, alive with drama, coming to a climax on one side of the choir with the dance of Salome, on the other with the stoning of Stephen. Filippo found the task too wearisome for his mobility. Twice he ran away from it. In 1461, Cosimo persuaded Pius II to release the artist from his monastic vows. Filippo seems to have thought himself also freed from fidelity to Lucrezia, who could no longer pose as a virgin. The Prato wardens exhausted all schemes for luring him back to his frescoes. At last, 10 years after their inception, he was induced to finish them by Carlo de' Medici, Cosimo's illegitimate son, now an apostolic notary. In the scene of Stephen's burial, Filippo exercised all his powers, in the deceptive perspective of the architectural background, in the sharply individualized figures surrounding the corpse, and in the stout proportions and calm rotund face of Cosimo's bastard reading the services for the dead. Despite his sexual irregularities, and perhaps because of his amiable sensitivity to the loveliness of woman, Filippo's finest pictures were of the Virgin. They missed the ethereal spirituality of Angelico's Madonnas, but they conveyed a deep sense of soft physical beauty and infinite tenderness. In Fra Lippo, the Holy Family became an Italian family, surrounded with homely incidents, and the Virgin took on a sensuous loveliness heralding the pagan Renaissance. To these feminine charms, Filippo, in his Madonnas, added an airy grace that passed down to his apprentice, Botticelli. In 1466, the city of Spoleto invited him to tell the story of the Virgin again in the apse of its cathedral. He labored conscientiously, passion having cooled, but his powers failed with his passion, and he could not repeat the excellence of his Prato murals. Amid this effort he died in 1469, poisoned, Vasari thought, by the relatives of a girl whom he had seduced. The story is improbable, for Filippo was buried in the Spoleto Cathedral, and there, a few years later, his son, on commission from Lorenzo de' Medici, built for his father a splendid marble tomb. Everyone who creates beauty deserves remembrance, but we must pass in shameful haste by Domenico Veneziano and his supposed murderer, Andrea del Castagno. Domenico was called from Perugia in 1439 to paint murals in Santa Maria Nuova. He had as his aide a promising youth from Borgo San Sepolcro, Piero della Francesca, and in these works, now lost, he made one of the earliest Florentine experiments with paints mixed in oil. He has left us one masterpiece, the portrait of a woman, now in Berlin, with upswept hair, wistful eyes, obtrusive nose, and bulging bosom. According to Vasari, Domenico taught the new technique to Andrea del Castagno, who was also painting murals in Santa Maria Nuova. Rivalry may have marred their friendship, for Andrea was a dour and passionate man. Vasari tells how he murdered Domenico, but other records relate that Domenico outlived Andrea by 4 years. Andrea reached fame by his picture of the scourging of Christ in the cloister of Santa Croce, where his tricks of perspective astonished even his fellow artists. Hidden away in the old monastery of Santa Polonia in Florence are his imaginary portraits of Dante, Petrarch, Boccaccio, Farinata degli Uberti, a vivid representation of the swashbuckler Pippo Spana, and a Last Supper from 1450 that seems poorly drawn and lifeless, but may have suggested an idea or two to Leonardo nonetheless. 8. A Miscellany. To feel with any vividness the life of art in Cosimo's Florence, we must not only contemplate those major geniuses whom we have here commemorated so hurriedly. We must enter the side streets and alleys of art and visit 100 shops and studios where potters shaped and painted clay, or glassmakers blew or cut glass into forms of fragile loveliness, or goldsmiths fashioned precious metals or stone into gems and medals, seals and coins, and 1,000 ornaments of dress or person, home or church. We must hear noisy, intent artisans beating or chasing iron, copper, or bronze into weapons and armor, vessels and utensils and tools. We must watch the cabinet makers designing, carving, inlaying, or surfacing wood, engravers cutting designs into metal, and other workers chiseling chimney pieces, or tooling leather, or carving ivory, or producing delicate textiles to make flesh seductive or adorn a home. We must enter convents and see patient monks illuminating manuscripts, placid nuns stitching storied tapestries. Above all, we must picture a population developed enough to understand beauty, and wise enough to give honor, sustenance, and stimulus to those who consumed themselves in its making. Metal engraving was one of the inventions of Florence, and its Gutenberg died in the same year as Cosimo. Tommaso Finiguera was a worker in niello, that is, he cut designs into metal or wood and filled the cavities with a black compound of silver and lead. One day, says a pretty story, a stray piece of paper or cloth fell upon a metal surface just inlaid. Removed, it was found imprinted with the design. The tale has the earmarks of an afterthought. In any case, Finiguera and others deliberately took such impressions on paper in order to judge of the effect of the engraved patterns. Baccio Baldini, circa 1450, a Florentine goldsmith, was apparently the first to take such impressions from incised metal surfaces as a means of preserving and multiplying the drawings of artists. Botticelli, Mantegna, and others supplied him with designs. A generation later, Marcantonio Raimondi would develop the new technique of engraving into a means of broadcasting all but the color of Renaissance paintings to the world. We have kept for the last a man who defies classification and can best be understood as the embodied synthesis of his time. Leon Battista Alberti lived every phase of his century except the political. He was born in Venice of a Florentine exile, returned to Florence when Cosimo was recalled, and fell in love with its art, its music, its literary and philosophical coteries. Florence responded by hailing him as almost a monstrously perfect man. He was both handsome and strong, excelled in all bodily exercises, could, with feet tied, leap over a standing man, could, in the great cathedral, throw a coin far up to ring against the vault, amused himself by taming wild horses and climbing mountains. He was a good singer, an eminent organist, a charming conversationalist, an eloquent orator, a man of alert but sober intelligence, a gentleman of refinement and courtesy, generous to all but women, whom he satirized with unpleasant persistence and possibly artificial indignation. Caring little about money, he committed the care of his property to his friends and shared its income with them. Men can do all things if they will, he said, and indeed there were few major artists in the Italian Renaissance who did not excel in several arts. Like Leonardo, half a century later, Alberti was a master, or at least a skilled practitioner, in a dozen fields: mathematics, mechanics, architecture, sculpture, painting, music, poetry, drama, philosophy, civil and canon law. He wrote on nearly all these subjects, including a treatise on painting that influenced Piero della Francesca and perhaps Leonardo. He added 2 dialogues on women and the art of love, and a famous essay on the care of the family. After painting a picture, he would call in children and ask them what it meant. If it puzzled them, he considered it a failure. He was among the first to discover the possibilities of the camera obscura. Predominantly an architect, he passed from city to city, raising facades or chapels in the Roman style. In Rome, he shared in planning the buildings with which, as Vasari put it, Nicholas V was turning the capital upside down. In Rimini, he transformed the old church of San Francesco into almost a pagan temple. In Florence, he raised a marble front for the church of Santa Maria Novella, and built for the Rucellai family a chapel in the church of San Pancrazio, and 2 palaces of simple and stately design. In Mantua, he adorned the cathedral with a chapel of the Incoronata, and faced the church of Sant'Andrea with a facade in the form of a Roman triumphal arch. He composed a comedy, Philodoxus, in such idiomatic Latin that no one doubted him when, as a hoax on his time, he passed it off as the newly discovered work of an ancient author. And Aldus Manutius, himself a scholar, printed it as a Roman classic. He wrote his treatises in chatty dialogue form, and in bare and simple Italian, so that even a busy businessman might read him. His religion was rather Roman than Christian, but he was always a Christian when he heard the cathedral choir. Looking far ahead, he expressed the fear that the decline of Christian belief would plunge the world into a chaos of conduct and ideas. He loved the countryside around Florence, retired to it whenever he could, and made the title character of his dialogue, Teogenio, say, "The society of the illustrious dead can be enjoyed by me at leisure here, and when I choose to converse with sages, statesmen, or great poets, I have but to turn to my bookshelves, and my company is better than any that your palaces can afford, with all their crowd of clients and flatterers." Cosimo agreed with him and found no greater solace in his old age than his villas, his intimates, his art collection, and his books. He suffered severely from gout, and in his final years left the internal affairs of the state to Luca Pitti, who abused the opportunity to add to his wealth. Cosimo's own fortune had not been diminished by his numerous charities. He whimsically complained that God always kept a step ahead of him in returning his benefactions with interest. In his country seats he applied himself to the study of Plato, under the tutelage of his protégé Ficino. When Cosimo lay dying, it was on the authority of Plato's Socrates, not on that of Christ, that Ficino promised him a life beyond the grave. Friends and enemies alike grieved over his death in 1464, fearing chaos in the government, and almost the entire city followed his corpse to the tomb that he had commissioned Desiderio de Settignano to prepare for him in the church of San Lorenzo. Patriots like Guicciardini, angered by the conduct of the later Medici, thought of him as Brutus thought of Caesar. Machiavelli honored him as he honored Caesar. Cosimo had overthrown the Republic, but the freedom he had checked was the liberty of the rich to rule the state with factious violence. Though he sullied his record with occasional cruelty, his reign was by and large one of the most genial, peaceful, and orderly periods in the history of Florence, and the other was that of the grandson who had been trained by his precedents. Rarely had any prince been so wisely generous or so genuinely interested in the advancement of mankind. "I owe much to Plato," said Ficino, "but to Cosimo no less. He realized for me the virtues of which Plato gave me the conception." Under him, the humanist movement flowered. Under him, the diverse genius of Donatello, Fra Angelico, and Lippi received bountiful encouragement. Under him, Plato, so long overshadowed by Aristotle, returned into the mind stream of humanity. When a year had passed after Cosimo's death, and time had had a chance to dull his glory and reveal his faults, The Florentine signory voted to inscribe upon his tomb the noblest title it could confer, Pater Patriae, Father of his country. And it was deserved. With him the Renaissance lifted its head. Under his grandson it reached its purest excellence. Under his great-grandson it conquered Rome. Many sins may be forgiven to such a dynasty. This book is continued at this point on the other side of this cassette. Please reverse or turn the cassette over now.